So I'm going to talk about predominantly clinical trials in the post-truth era. And what I believe is that dishonesty in medical research is endemic, and part of the problem is it's international. So it's often very difficult to police because you have researchers in one country, journals in another country, and you're doing collaborative work across countries. With academics, research fraud is often linked to pressure to publish for promotion and security of tenure. But for clinicians, the problem is often different. And I'm going to talk about the issue of financial conflicts of interest, because people will often falsify research because, in fact, they're getting enormous sums of money from industry and they want to stay on side with industry and continue to get the enormous sums. In some cases, and in one case that I reported to the GMC, a doctor actually had a bonus arrangement with the company doing the research. And that doesn't make for independent analysis of your data. And often there's promises of future work, there's share ownership and patents in medical devices, because in some fields like cardiology, cardiologists may own the patents. Another driver for dishonesty is private practice. And there are cases where senior doctors who don't need to worry about promotion or tenure have got people to falsify data on outcomes, survival, because if they publish their true survival data, it would harm their private practice. And some of these people are earning much more in private practice than they do from the NHS. And sometimes there is simple, downright financial fraud. People receive large grants to conduct studies and just make it up and pocket the money. And I, with two other doctors, Peter Wilmshurst and Harvey Markowitz, when Harvey was the chairman of the Committee on Publication Ethics, looked at one country which was taking part in an international study of an intervention in cardiovascular disease, and they'd received funding for about $5 million US, and they just made up the data rather than collect any data. And the reason they fell foul is that they got the expected result when all the other countries got the unexpected result. And secondly, because one of the crooks involved thought that they hadn't received a big enough share of the $5 million US, and therefore went to the sponsors and squealed, asking if they would make up the money that they thought they should have received. So the conflicts and the financial interest can be much greater and can be enormous. And one of the problems we have in research, which, for example, wouldn't apply in accountancy, we wouldn't trust people if you were dealing with money to be honest. And in fact, university employees, the universities don't actually trust you to go into their safe and take your money out of a bag of money, your salary out of a bag of money at the end of the month. But paradoxically, they trust you to publish whatever you like and believe that you're honest enough to publish the truth. And of course, most people are, hopefully. But there are big incentives not to publish the truth if your job depends on it. And journals and academic institutions have to pretend that there is this general integrity among scientists, because, of course, if the Lancet or another journal said, well, a good proportion of what we're publishing this week is just made up, who would buy the Lancet? Particularly if they say, well, we don't know which of the articles in this week's issue of the Lancet is made up. And who would fund research if we knew the true extent of the fraud? So institutions have a code of silence to protect themselves primarily, but also it protects the crooks. I'll talk more about what I see as an illogical position of the Committee on Publication Ethics around this later. And I think that some researchers are born dishonest and others have dishonesty thrust upon them. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But all this harms patients, it wastes resources, and the effects are far more serious than academics, institutions and journals admit, because you often see it said that science is self-correcting. But in medicine, that's not always true. And if you're harmed or die as a result of false research, it is really no consolation to you that 10 years down the line, science will be correcting itself. You want it right in the first place. And I want to talk about examples. And one example is Professor Don Poldermans at the Erasmus Medical Centre in Rotterdam. And he was the principal investigator in a series of multicentre trials with the acronym DECREASE. And what they showed was that perioperative beta blockers improve survival of high-risk patients having non-cardiac surgery. And Poldermans and another member of the steering committee of DECREASE, Professor Bax, were high up in the European Society of Cardiology and influenced the guidelines of the European Society, so that the European Society of Cardiology produced guidelines recommending perioperative beta blockers for this patient group. The problem was that Poldermans, and people say it was just Poldermans, falsified research in these studies. The first thing that bothers me about this is that how does one individual falsify a large amount of research in multi-center studies? Who else is analyzing and auditing the data to make sure that it's kosher? But anyway, most of these studies, 5 of the 6, were found to have research misconduct. The very first one, none of the data is available for analysis, so we don't know if the first study was kosher. But Poldermans was sacked from Erasmus, and subsequent studies have shown that, in fact, this line of treatment increases mortality by 27%. And it's been estimated that as a result of these guidelines, the ESC guidelines based on this fraudulent research, in 10 years, approximately 800,000 excess patient deaths occurred in Europe, about 80,000 of them in the UK. That's, that's a statistical estimate, but in terms of numbers, we're talking about the number of people killed in the Syrian civil war. So why people who do this sort of fraud do not end up in prison at the International Criminal Court, I don't know. And furthermore, the ESC guidelines have not been withdrawn. And the British Cardiovascular Society adheres to the ESC guidelines because we are affiliated. People know there is this problem, but one of the reasons why they're not withdrawn is, I think, that Professor Bax was president of the ESC for the last 3 years until last summer, and therefore it was politically difficult to do anything about withdrawing them when the president had been involved in the trials on the steering committee and involved in getting the guidelines through. So this is a big problem. It's a political problem which is harming patients. Now, my interest started, as Mike said, when I was working on amrinone. I don't want to talk about the lab work I did. I'm going to talk about the clinical work I did on the drug amrinone, made by Sterling Winthrop, which is now part of Sanofi. And I found that the drug, which was hoped would help people with heart failure, was both ineffective and unsafe. It produced thrombocytopenia in 50% of patients given the drug for a week. It produced eosinophilia in a fair number, polycirrhosis, splenomegaly, and everyone had intractable vomiting. So I told the company that it didn't work before publishing, because that was our deal. We said we would tell them it before publishing. It didn't work and it was unsafe. And the company's response, their initial response, was to ask me to take out some of the patients. And if I'd taken them out, in fact, it would have looked rather better than it was, because they asked me to take out all the ones where contractility indices went down. As you realize it, when nothing happens, you get a few patients where contractility goes up and a few where it goes down, but statistically there's no change. They asked me to take out the ones where it went down, and of course it would have left all the ones where it went up. And I said I couldn't do that because, the patients had agreed to take part in the research. We had to use their data. So they offered me the equivalent of 2 years' salary not to publish at all. And I said I had to publish. So they said, well, before we publish, could they bring an American professor of cardiology, an opinion leader, across to speak to me and my boss? And we agreed. And they brought over a very well-known professor. And he spoke to us. And he said, we were the only people getting these results. If we publish, people will think that the lab is incompetent, we can't do the experiments right, and we will be discredited. And this affected my boss more than me, and he was more worried. But we went ahead and published. And as soon as we published, I was contacted by 3 American professors of cardiology. And they each said they got results just like us. But they hadn't published. And the reason they hadn't published is when they told Sterling Winthrop, they brought the same professor of cardiology along to see them. And he said, you were the only people getting these results. If you publish, you will be discredited. And so they didn't publish, or not until after. And then I published a paper on the side effects of amrinone in the British Heart Journal. And 10 days later, I was contacted by Dr. Leo Offerhouse from the Netherlands Committee for the Evaluation of Medicines. He said he didn't understand my reports of thrombocytopenia, eosinophilia, autoimmune inflammatory problems, because they weren't in my clinical records forms. And I said, well, of course they're in my clinical records forms. I've got copies. And he and I compared my copies with what had been submitted. And he had been given forgeries by the company. So the drug was withdrawn in Europe, but it was the company were continuing in the USA until the following year, when Sterling Winthrop told the FDA that they were withdrawing the drug worldwide, because in the first 1,200 patients given the drug, there were more than 1,400 life-threatening side effects. But 2 years later, I discovered that they were selling the drug over the counter in parts of Africa and Asia, even though by then we knew it increased patient mortality by about a third. So you could buy it in Africa and Asia just over the counter in a pharmacy, whereas in Europe and North America, you couldn't even get it on a doctor's prescription. What's more, there were breaches of the Medicines Act in the UK, but the company said that if prosecuted, they would shut down pharmaceutical manufacturing in the UK. They threatened the Department of Health, and the government decided not to prosecute them. And I tried to get medical journals like the BMJ, Lancet and Nature to report this, and they all gave me very nice lunches, but all said they couldn't take on a multinational pharmaceutical company who risked being sued. So I went to the Guardian newspaper. They looked at the same evidence, and their lawyers said there was no trouble publishing. They published on the front page, the back page, in the whole of an inside page, and then on the next day. So the drug was withdrawn worldwide. we went to the WHO, I should have said, and I went to Oxfam and asked them if they would get proof that the drug was being sold over the counter in these countries. And they collected proof of purchase, and we took it to the WHO in Geneva. So the drug was withdrawn worldwide. But this is just one example, because in fact, there are many examples of pharmaceutical companies, Merck, Pfizer, Glaxo, where they've concealed data that drugs are harming patients. And these are some examples, and there are others, where they know that drugs are harming patients because, of course, drug companies are not there to give you the best drug for your patient. They are there to make a profit for their shareholders, just like any other company, and that is their ethical responsibility. And although I'd been complaining to the GMC for years about misconduct, the first pair of cases I got to the GMC involved Professor Tim Peters and a surgeon, A.K. Banerjee, at King's. And I reported this when they'd been found guilty of serious professional misconduct by the GMC. I reported it in the BMJ, I think it was in 2002, and this is the report. But the key bits are that Professor Peters agreed to co-author research that the GMC said he knew or should have known was fraudulent. In fact, all of the research done by Banerjee at King's during the 3 years he was there was fraudulent. The inquiry that was held at King's knew that, but in fact, King's concealed that fact for a decade. They silenced the whistleblowers. They didn't tell the three funders, which were two charities and the MRC. They didn't repay a penny of the research grants. And what's more, they allowed Banerjee to submit his fraudulent research, entirely made up, for a Master of Surgery degree from London University. Master of Surgery is a postgraduate degree. Surgeons take it. It's a bit like a PhD, not quite the same, but it's a research degree. And we know that, in fact, London University were notified by a whistleblower, a lecturer, that the data in the Master of Surgery degree was false. And I've got a copy of the letter sent by the whistleblower to the registrar at London University, and I've got a copy of the acknowledgement of the registrar from London University admitting or accepting that they've been told it's false, but they still gave him the Master of Surgery degree. In fact, Peters is not a surgeon, so he could not officially be Banerjee's supervisor for a Master of Surgery degree. So another professor at King's, Professor Kakar, certified that he had supervised this research. It would have been a false declaration even if Banerjee had actually submitted true data. But in fact, since it was entirely made up, it was doubly false declaration. So both of them, both of Banerjee and Peters was found guilty of serious professional misconduct. Peters kept his A+ distinction award, which effectively doubled his NHS salary and doubled his pension. Banerjee was suspended from the medical register initially for a year. The day he got back on, I was allowed to report him again, and I reported him. I had to wait while he was off because the GMC said they couldn't do anything about his other misconduct while he was off the medical register because he wasn't a practicing doctor. So I had to wait till the day he got back on, report him again, and he was then struck off. And he was struck off for nearly 6 years, but got back on in 2008. And it took 24 years to get London University to withdraw the Master of Surgery degree that they knew all along was false. It was 14 years after the GMC transcripts showed it was false. It was 14 years after the editor of Gut wrote to them pointing out it was false, because it was the same data as in the retracted papers following the GMC hearing. And it took repeated badgering. And it was finally when Private Eye wrote an article pointing out the problem that King's and London University finally withdrew Banerjee's Master of Surgery degree. Sorry, pressed the wrong one then. And 6 years after he got back on the medical register, Banerjee got a national award, an MBE, for services to patient safety. This is a man who was removed from the medical register for, in fact, harming patients. On 2 occasions, he was removed for a total of 8 years. So, but he only kept the MBE for 2 months. I wrote to the Cabinet Office, the government, various members of Parliament, and after 2 months they withdrew his MBE. Now, another study I was involved with, I was the principal cardiologist in this study, which is a migraine intervention study with a medical device. But you won't see my name on the paper, although I was the principal cardiologist and one of the 5 members of the steering committee. Simon Nightingale, who was also on the steering committee, his name isn't on the paper. And the reason we wouldn't put our name on the paper was because we were concerned that the data was false. You will see there are 15 authors. Mike Mullen and David Hildick-Smith have declared share ownership in the company. They weren't the only ones with share ownership. Andrew Dowson, the first author, also dealt in NMT shares during the company, during the trial rather. And NMT have admitted that 10 of these 15 individuals were paid consultants to the company, but only 1 declared it in the conflicts of interest. But what's even more surprising is that when NMT appointed Dowson to be the principal headache specialist and chief investigator, they knew that in an unrelated industry-sponsored trial, he had admitted falsifying research. And he was at that time waiting for an appearance before the General Medical Council. And he appeared before them in 2006 and was found guilty of misconduct in an unrelated trial. It may seem strange that a medical device company would use, not only for the MIST trial, but for a follow-up trial, MIST-3, a doctor who has admitted falsifying research in an unrelated trial. But in fact, NMT used a clinician as principal investigator in another US trial and as co-principal investigator in a US trial, a cardiologist who had received an official written warning from the FDA that he might face criminal prosecution for misconduct in research. During the MIST trial, Dowson received consultancy fees for his role as chief investigator. And at his GMC hearing, it was about £2,000 per week. The trial went on for almost 4 years, 3 years, 9 months. And Dowson, between Dowson joining and the paper being published. And Dowson said he was still receiving payments from NMT when the paper was published, although he didn't declare this in the paper, because he was at that point the chief investigator of another NMT trial. In addition to these monies, he was receiving payments for recruiting patients and seeing them. Preliminary data suggested the trial might have encouraging results. The steering committee were informed, and it was decided I would present these at EuroPCR. So only the steering committee knew. Dowson knew, and I wasn't due to present it for a month. And a week later, Dowson bought his NMT shares, and he sold them before the share price dropped when it was found that, in fact, the device didn't work. So he didn't declare his conflicts of interest. The paper had false statements. It had missing statements about the harms done to patient. For example, it didn't, in the original version, point out that in some patients the device fell out of their atrial septum to lie free in the heart, or even be carried by blood flow into the pulmonary artery with potentially lethal consequences, and that patients needed additional procedures to remove these. These were not mentioned in the original version. I complained about that. A new version was published with a long correction. Fiona Godley said it was the longest correction she's ever, the BMJ said it's the longest correction she's ever seen. But in fact, even with that, the corrected version is false. So it has errors. And that's because, in fact, I'm sure both versions, well, we know that the first version was partly written by a marketing manager of NMT, the vice president who was European marketing manager of the company. That was never disclosed. So we have big problems there and large sums of money. £2,000 a week for 4 years, that's £400,000. But it wasn't only what was published in circulation. It was what was published on, for example, the Royal Brompton and Harefield website, where it claimed, for example, if you look here, you'll see here, I don't know if you can see it, their study indicated that as many as 40% of patients could have their migraine symptoms significantly relieved through interventions to close holes in their heart. Well, we didn't show that. In fact, we showed the opposite. And here you'll see it says Dr. Mullen, shareholder in the company, employee at the Royal Brompton. This is significant news for migraine sufferers. For the first time, this study has shown that closing a PFO can have a substantial effect in reducing the symptoms of patients with severe migraine. We showed it didn't work. And they had one patient who is shown here on the website saying how her migraine has been improved. There were 147 patients, only 3 patients who had the device implanted in the implant group out of 74 who had the implant were migraine free during the analysis period. And the same was true, 3 out of 73 in the sham operated group were migraine free. So there was no benefit, but in fact, they've taken out of context a single patient's anecdote to give entirely the opposite impression. And if you would click down here on the bottom where it says missed website, you could click on there and put in your postcode and it would tell you who the nearest cardiologist is who would close your PFO as a private patient to ease your migraine when we knew that the treatment did not work. Here's another study. This is a paper in the Lancet in 2008 by Paolo Macchiarini and colleagues. It was a clinical transplantation of a tissue-engineered airway. And the principal investigators were Macchiarini, the first author, and Birchall, the last author. But I draw your attention to the second author, Philip Youngblood. And that's because Macchiarini and Youngblood have both been found guilty of research misconduct when working at another hospital at the Karolinska. Now, this research was conducted, or the operation was conducted in Barcelona at the Hospital Clinic Barcelona, but the airway that was engineered, that was performed by Martin Birchall's group in Bristol, and they took a cadaveric trachea, decellularized it, and then they claimed to have put stem cells from the recipient on the cadaveric decellularized trachea, and then Machiarini, that was in Birchall's lab in Bristol, and then it was implanted by Machiarini in Barcelona. Now, the findings are just 2 sentences. Don't worry about reading those because I've printed them off somewhere else in bigger print. And this is the patient, Claudia Castillo, and for her, she was very lucky because they implanted this trachea in her left main bronchus, not in her trachea. She had a bronchial stenosis. And that was fortunate because you can do without one lung. And I don't apologize for showing her face because her face has been shown repeatedly by the people who documented this, Machiarini and colleagues, because they've used it as publicity for this technique. And what they claimed was, in their findings in white, the graft immediately provided the recipient with a functional airway, improved their quality of life, and had a normal appearance of mechanical properties at 4 months. And they said that the patient had no donor antibodies and was not on immunosuppressive drugs. The second sentence may be true, but the first sentence is entirely false. We now know that there was no improvement in lung function, that the airway didn't have normal mechanical properties because it collapsed at 4 months, because it collapsed at 3 weeks and needed to be stented. And because there was a stent in there, it couldn't have had a normal appearance. She had repeated stenting and subsequently had a left pneumonectomy. But the senior authors moved on from there. Now, Paolo Machiarini moved to the Karolinska Institute, and it's commonly believed that he was headhunted for this prestigious institute, which of course awards the Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology. But in fact, he'd already been sacked by the Barcelona clinic, the hospital clinic, because at that point they discovered that he had made false claims about the trial. So he moved to the Karolinska and continued tracheal transplantation with fatal outcomes for patients. And he was also given an honorary contract at UCL because Birchall had moved from Bristol to UCL in London, where he continued tracheal transplants, both at University College Hospital and Great Ormond Street. And that had fatal consequences for young patients in the UK. And these are 2 of them who died. Shauna Davidson died 15 days after a tracheal transplant when her trachea collapsed and she suffocated. And Kezia Shorten had even a more prolonged and protracted unpleasant death. And I show these pictures because I've taken them off the UCL site. They've actually used these to suggest that this treatment was beneficial. It wasn't. These people ended up far worse off, well, dead. And yet they've given the impression that they've actually helped these patients because it was profitable, I think, for the institution to do so. At the Karolinska, Machiarini's contract was terminated, and an investigation found that he, Youngblood, and 5 other co-investigators were guilty of misconduct. The Karolinska asked that 6 publications that originated there be retracted, including 2 of which were published in The Lancet. But it didn't include the 2008 paper because that didn't come from the Karolinska, it came from Barcelona. And it didn't include a 5-year follow-up paper that also nominally was dealt with the Barcelona patient. I should say also that if you don't know, Maciarini has received a prison sentence in Italy, I think 16 months. Although I don't think he's in Italy, I think he's in Russia, so they haven't actually got him in prison. I think it's in his absence. We know that when a new director of the hospital clinic in Barcelona was appointed, he informed the Lancet that the claims in the 2008 paper are false, but Richard Horton, the editor, has refused repeated requests to retract the paper, some of them from me, but from other people. Trish Murray, Raphael Levy, various people. And even last year when Norman Lamb, the chairman of the Science and Technology Committee, and Sarah Wollaston, the chair of the Health and Social Care Committees, jointly wrote to Horton asking for an explanation of what was going on, pointing out that in their letter, which they kindly sent me a copy of, that Horton had been rather slow at withdrawing the paper by Andrew Wakefield, that, the MMR paper, but Horton still hasn't withdrawn the paper. And he cites advice he's received from COPE that just because an author's work has been found to be ethically compromised, it doesn't mean that every paper from the period is compromised. It doesn't mean that earlier work was necessarily compromised. Well, of course, in the case of this 2008 paper, we not only have the fact that Maciarini and Youngblood have repeatedly falsified research, but we have evidence that there is false research in the 2008 paper. There's no doubt about it. And the Lancet knows that. And I also have concerns that we shouldn't presume integrity when an author has been shown repeatedly to be dishonest. It doesn't make any sense. I would not leave my money with an accountant who had repeatedly defrauded other, or a financial advisor if he'd repeatedly defrauded other clients. And I don't think any of us would, but why should we trust the integrity of an author who has been shown repeatedly to be dishonest? UCH and UCL are really supporting Birchall, and I think that the reason may be because he's still dragging in large sums of money for his engineered airway research, although it's hard to see where this is going to go when it's done so much harm to patients. Of the 20 people we know have had tracheal transplants, 17 we know are definitely dead. Castillo is alive, but then she didn't have a trachea transplant. She had a main bronchus. So there's only 2 other people who may be alive, but we're not really sure. So this is not apparently going anywhere, but UCH, UCL do not want to admit that they've made a mistake, I think. We've got other trials, so Selexia, that's co-founded by Anjan Reginald, who was a dentist until the General Dental Council struck him off for research fraud. And he is a co-founder of the company with Professor Sir Martin Evans, the Nobel laureate, who's now aged, I think, 79. And they have approval to inject stem cells, so-called stem cells, into the heart of cardiac patients at the Royal Brompton. And they got that by telling MHRA and HRA that they'd done earlier studies in Greece with the cells. But it turns out that was untrue. They used different cells. But even though it turns out that they've not told MHRA or HRA the truth, they've been told they can still go ahead with this trial. And I find it very worrying that you've got someone heading a company who's been struck off from dental practice because of fraud, lying to regulators, and the regulators say, well, never mind, carry on and do the experiments in people. And I think the problem starts back in medical education. You'll see that one US anonymous survey, 58% of medical students reported they cheated, and similar number of UK students. And the interesting thing from a UK study was that the proportion actually increased from less than 20% of medical students being prepared to cheat in their first year to over 80% in their fifth year. And there are reports of medical schools in the UK failing to punish people who falsified or cheated in exams. So juniors see people prosper from dishonesty. And an example of prospering from dishonesty is Patrick Parfrey, who published 2 papers in The Lancet in 1981. His colleagues retracted them. 7 months later, he moved to Canada. You might think that's his career over. He became Professor of Medicine, Associate Dean of Clinical Research of the Eastern Provinces of Canada. So it didn't affect his career. And I find there's lots of connections. So you look at John Darcy, 80 papers retracted when he worked in Eugene Brumwell's department at Harvard. Across the other side of the, and I should say that the inquiry showed that Eugene Brumwell knew that Darcy was falsifying research, but didn't stop him continuing. In San Diego, Bob Slutsky, 79 papers retracted, and it was shown, I certainly knew for 5 years that Slutsky was falsifying research. He in fact told me he was, and colleagues told me he was when I was there in 81 and 82. People were putting in their names on papers they knew he had falsified. Now, that he was in John Ross's department, of course, Eugene Brumwell had been the person who set up the department at San Diego and had been John Ross's boss. And when Eugene Brumwell moved to Harvard, John Ross became the department head. In this country, you could look at Edgar South and at Guys, who put pressure on his juniors to be authors of falsified angioplasty mortality rates because the true rates that when published would have harmed his private practice. You don't have to take my word for his dishonesty. You can read about it in Hansard, the records from the UK Parliament, where his dishonesty and harm to patients is documented. And working for Southern at that time was Clive Handler, who went on to commit dishonesty, and his medical director, Professor Peter Richards, agreed to conceal Handler's dishonesty from both the police and the General Medical Council. And the remarkable thing was that Professor Peter Richards was a member of the General Medical Council at the time. In fact, he was chairman of its Professional Conduct Committee. He was, in effect, the chief judge of the General Medical Council, because the General Medical Council has the Conduct Committee, which deals with discipline and striking doctors off, but also has other functions like medical education. So their chief judge agreed to conceal the misconduct. So in conclusion, misconduct is common because the rewards are high, the risks of fraudsters are low, it's concealed by institutions and journals, the guilty escape serious sanctions often, and patients are harmed. But I'll just leave you with one slide. There are some good guys. These are some people that have been working over the years. I thought I could put up about 20 names just to leave them there. There are more, but if I'd put up, these are the first 20 I thought of. If I'd put up more, then they'd be too small for you to see. So there are good people working to deal with research misconduct, but some of them have lost their jobs, some have fought legal actions, and it's cost them dearly. So anyway, just so you know, there are decent people out there. Okay, thank you very much.
Peter, thank you. I don't know whether everybody can hear me, but Peter, if you could stop sharing your screen now, we can go back to the general gallery mode view. Perfect. Thank you, Peter. We have some questions in the Q&A box. I think there's I sense a general stunned silence out there as people are shocked really by what you've told us, although perhaps not surprised. I think the honesty with which you've presented the case and openness with which you've done so has probably stunned a few people. It is a horrendous story that you've told us, Peter, because I suspect you're also only scratching away at the tip of a very large iceberg. So thank you for what you've told us. Thank you for what you've done. If you could just pull up the Q&A box on the right, and could I just ask the participants, please? Some people are putting comments in the chat box. It would be very helpful if you could just cut and paste or type your message into the Q&A box so that we've got them all in the one place. So, Peter, we've got, I don't know whether you can see the Q&A box open in front of you.
Yeah, I can see one from Viva Rani. We see scientific fraud in well-repped publications. What makes the scientific and researchers do such fraud for recognition, frustration, funds?
I think you probably missed your introduction, actually, Peter.
Sorry?
I think you probably missed your introduction where you explained it quite well.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's I think it's for money and prestige and so on. So we've got an anonymous one. In 2016, there was data showing that protein pumps inhibitors like
proton pumps.
Sorry?
Proton pump, the proton pump inhibitors, like
esomeprazole pose greater risk for cardiovascular disease when taken for long-term. FDA guidelines clearly indicate that these drugs should not be used for more than 8 weeks. After this study, several population studies came up ill effects of these drugs on multiple organ dysfunction. Has the clinical community taken the issue seriously? Is there any action taken on these drugs? These drugs are still sold over the counter in many countries. Well, I don't know is the answer. I mean, they are sold over the counter. They are taken long-term by many patients. And I don't know, it's not really my field, proton pump inhibitors. So I don't know the answer to that. Move down. Danny Fabian. This is indeed a very welcome topic, really interesting. I'm just sitting back, left shocked that these things are happening. I don't understand it's possible for leading principal investigators to pocket money that was a grant for patient work, etc. Well, yes. Well, it's how do you get away with it? But people do. That's the fact, isn't it? So.
Yeah, I think Danny Fabian is not the only one sitting there in his chair going, "What on earth?" I think there's a lot of people, as Mike said, that are stunned by this.
I think in the answer to the next question, which is another question from Vibarani, we will post this video on online on YouTube. If you want to look at the slides in more detail, you'll find them there. So just view the video. I think that's the best answer to that one. Peter, the next question from Sina Hadipur.
Yeah, the studies of medical students' dishonesty is a little dated. Is there more recent data on these values given the changing curriculum at many medical schools? I don't know. I don't think so. But I think the end results are very similar in that I think that there are still lots of dishonest people coming through in medicine. Not the majority. I'm not suggesting it's the majority, but still too many. And I can't actually personally see why doctors need to do this because, in the NHS, we certainly get enough money from the NHS, but some people seem to have a different sort of lifestyle expectation.
Peter, do you mind if I just interject? I mean, do you think this is not surely specific to medicine? This is just human nature to some extent, maybe? Or do you think this is specific to medicine?
No, I don't think it's specific to medicine. But there's a very interesting book called Blind Eye, which deals with the story of Michael Swango, who was the American equivalent of Harold Shipman, the mass murdering doctor in this country. And it's very interesting how he's probably killed more than 60 patients and some colleagues. And it's remarkable how in the book it's described how he actually got away with this. He's actually in prison for life in the US for multiple murders. He was caught in a state that does not have the death penalty, and I understand, and it was agreed that if he confessed, he would not be sent to us or extradited to another state that does have the death penalty. So he's in prison for life. But the remarkable thing is how institutions became aware that he was killing their patients and just got rid of him. He went on to other institutions. I think, I don't know how, I often say that medical schools, the purpose of a medical school is to take an 18-year-old who wants to work for Médecins Sans Frontières and to convert them into a 23-year-old who wants to be a cosmetic surgeon in Harley Street or Beverly Hills. And that seems, because that seems to be what happens. So I don't know if it's changing. How do we as consumers of these research identify misconduct? What do we look out for? Well, the research is often done by very clever people. You know, doctors are generally fairly smart people, so it's not always possible. And in fact, it's often other doctors that realize that there's fraud gone on, but they will be silent about the fact that it's occurred. Oh, right. Well, that's just, okay, someone agreeing with me.
Always good.
There's one here asking if I can comment on, beside Ben Goldacre's, Natalie Rhodes, beside Ben Goldacre's book, Bad Pharma, can I recommend other one-stop resources for this topic? Well, there are a number of books by Peter Gersh from Denmark dealing with this. So I think it's some of his books would be worth reading. David Eisner, if you would give infinite power, how would you change things for the better so that less fraud occurred? Well, I think one of the things is that we should audit original data to see, or at least say that we will only publish data if it can be audited by independent people, or some of it, except selected, perhaps at random, for audit, so that if you submit a paper to a journal, they may say that 1 in 10 papers they wish to see the original patient data or the original lab data, and they will give it to someone who will look at it and check that it's right. And of course, if you then decide to withdraw your paper, then they should publish the fact that at that stage you withdrew your paper. So I think there'd have to be more audit, as we do with financial audits.
But you've experienced your own data being falsified. So do you not think that, that might occur as well in such cases?
I'm sorry, I missed that. My own data.
You have observed your own data being falsified. So do you not think that, falsification of data might occur in such circumstances as well?
Yes. Yes, of course we could. But if the journal were going to police this, then and check a selection of data, and we're going to deal with it, that's to say publish that papers were retracted at that point when they asked for the original data, then that would be a deterrent, I think. Yeah, sure, I've seen my data falsified. Part of the problem with the issue, why circulate, one of my concerns about circulation is they've not dealt with the mistrial paper properly. And I didn't go into why that was, for example, but one of the issues there was that the editor of circulation, Professor Loscalzo, is Brumwald's replacement at Harvard at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. The device used in the mistrial, the Starflex device, is owned by the Boston Children's Hospital. It was invented by a cardiologist, another professor of a pediatric cardiologist, James Locke, at the Boston Children's Hospital, which is, of course, is connected to the Brigham and Women's Hospital. They are adjacent and connected by bridges, so you can walk from one to other. So you've got the Boston Children's Hospital getting the patent rights, the money from every sale of device, and you're asking someone who works in the adjacent hospital to do something about what is clearly fraudulent research when it will affect the patents of the Boston Children's Hospital and the cardiologists in Boston who have royalties from the device. So things are very convoluted. But I think you need...
Peter, could I just interject there? I mean, it's interesting to compare David Eisner's talk with your talk, and David concentrated more on preclinical medicine. And we all know many examples of scientific fraud in preclinical medicine where people are falsifying, Western blots and things like that. But by and large, I know that hopefully our research preclinically does have an impact eventually, but we're not killing patients. We're killing rats and mice. Perhaps that's unethical, but the horrendous thing about your presentation here was the faces of those patients, and you realize that people are dying as a consequence of this, very large numbers of people, as your data showed. And it's a much more complex web in the clinical world than it is in the preclinical world. As you say, there's probably more money sloshing around with the devices and pharmaceuticals. There's also an intricate web, for example, the one you've just highlighted in Boston. Preclinical science is simpler. I don't think fraud's any less rare, sadly, in preclinical science, but it's a very different mix, isn't it? And as you say, that complicated mix of editors, journals, pharmaceutical industry, large amounts of money, it really is a recipe for disaster, really. And as David Eisner said just then, what are we going to do about it? I mean,
well,
it's a $1 billion question.
Yes. Well, I think one of the things that I would do is, of course, have criminal sanctions for people who falsify clinical research. I would put them in prison. I can't see how someone like Poldermans is not in prison, why he's not in prison. He ought to be. If you falsify research that leads to large numbers of deaths, I think you should be in prison.
Peter, we've got a significant number of questions, some long, some short, coming up. But perhaps if you could just sort of rattle through, if you're willing, with succinct answers to them, that would be great, because there's a lot of interest now and a head of steam building here. So,
all right. Here's one up from Carl Power about...
This is a long one.
Yeah, it's a bit of a long one. About the Macchiarini scandal. Yeah, so Macchiarini, he says that Macchiarini was engineering airways for patients in various countries. Well, it wasn't really Macchiarini doing it. It was people in the lab working with him, but there were a whole string of ethical Chernobyls. Why do you think this was? Well, should we feel confident the problem is confined to the Karolinska Institute? Well, I'm concerned about what's going on at UCL. And what went on at Bristol before, because there were concerns about how this device the original device was produced. It wasn't manufactured to good clinical practice standards. So I think there are all sorts of problems, and the main problem I see it is that regulators do not act appropriately when they see there are problems. There were opportunities to prosecute in this country for things about that device, but the regulators decided not to prosecute. It wasn't that there was no problems, because the manufacture of the device was not permitted by MHRA and so on in this country. But they decided not to prosecute, and that often happens. There is a failure to deal robustly with people, the regulators, when they've got the opportunities. I should say that I sat on a committee of the Commission on Human Medicines looking at outer place for stroke. And we were told what the conflicts of interest would debar us. We were actually told 7 times. And it turned out that there were 2 professors and 2 consultants, stroke physicians, who had 7 opportunities to disclose that they had conflicts of interest which would debar them, but they failed to do so. And they sat and gave opinions on the guidelines that we have for stroke thrombolysis without, at the time, revealing their conflicts of interest, which should have barred them. And regulators have done nothing about that. Good reference for the USA ending. Okay, that's just something that someone put in to help. How do you feel about interventional cardiology research? Do you feel that interventional cardiology industry research is systematically corrupt? Yes.
Simple answer.
Simon Peck, I hope you didn't cover this. I missed the beginning. Are you disturbed by the lack of action by the GMC? So what is the solution? The situation is unacceptable, as everyone will agree.
I think, Peter, we should probably, I think the reality is, I think you have been understandably British-centric because that's your experience, but I think it's probably fair to widen this out to our global audience, because I don't think it's just the GMC that is sitting on its hands here. It's other regulatory authorities. We've touched on the ESC, but the same is true in the US, the FDA, etc. So, I think the GMC has clearly sat on its hands over numerous occasions, but it's not just a British disease, this, in fairness. It is a global problem, and global regulatory authorities need to step up. Is that
yeah,
fair?
That's true. Yeah, I know, but I mean, the reason I know Simon asked is that, of course, he's investigates research misconduct. Investigates other forms of misconduct by doctors, financial misconduct, for one of the health insurers, and he has big problems with doctors who overbill patients, do inappropriate operations, and that sort of thing. And I know he gave evidence at the inquiry into Ian Patterson, the surgeon who was doing operations inappropriately. So the GMC is a big problem, and is failing to deal with the important issues. And Simon's right. I don't know how common fraud is. But it's too common. Daryl Francis, it's a shame that journals and institutions are fearful of striking down research research that they accepted in the past, as though it somehow means that they were stupid. It's not the journals or institutions' fault initially, because they took things at face value. It's their fault when they failed to correct their innocent errors. That is what they should be ashamed of. And I entirely agree. Do you think we should pressurize them and congratulate? Well, thanks very much. Yeah, I entirely agree, Daryl. That's absolutely true. And it is the failure to act when they are told that is the big problem. And that's why I'm annoyed really with the Lancet over the Macchiarini business, because they've not retracted the paper when they clearly should have. Do I see the internet, Twitter, as a potential correcting force? Well, I'm not sure, Donald. I'm not sure I'd listen to everything that's on the Twitter about medical treatments, particularly not what Donald Trump says. Ludwig Nays. When I say fraud is common, what do I mean? Well, I don't know, but maybe I think that it may be in clinical research, a quarter or half of papers have some spin put on it, which is not entirely correct, particularly when industry is involved. I think it's spun. Maggie Clamper, I know. Maggie, thanks very much. Is it worth enlarging on it? Well, I think people know that I've been sued a few times. In fact, Mike works at King's College London. They've threatened to sue me 3 times over the years, but they've never actually sued me yet. So, but NMT sued me 4 times for libel.
We need the money, Peter, so you're not safe yet.
No. Kim, thanks very much. Nice to hear from you. It is, I agree with you, it is the public who pays the ultimate price for this behaviour. And I agree with you, there are big concerns about what's happening with COVID-19 drugs. Anthony, yeah, nice to hear from you. If journals refuse to retract forced research, what other options are available? Well, that's difficult. The journals will say it's down to the authors and the institutions to retract, but it becomes very difficult. If you look at the paper from the Lancet, the 2008 paper, of course, some of the research was, the research or the clinical work was done in Barcelona. The patient was from Spain. The preparation of the trachea was done in Bristol. Some of the doctors, Macchiarini was originally Swiss, the English, Spanish, Italian doctors, and so there's quite a lot of nationalities involved, and who regulates this? And that can be a big problem, particularly when you're dealing with a paper that may be multinational. So,
Peter, can I just interject? We've still got a few questions, but we've got an audience of well over 100 people still tuning in. So if you're game to carry on answering questions, we can rattle through them. But could I ask the participants now not to post any more questions? I think we need to draw a line under it. Let Peter get to the end and let everybody crack on with their lives. So Peter, let's just go through a few more if you're willing.
Okay, yeah. So I thought Nirav has asked, I thought these types of misconduct only happened in basic science fields with animal studies, but this is much more shocking. I'm not sure how they can get unnoticed. Well, I suppose if you've got powerful people, powerful investigators, with big reputations, they can use their reputation. Certainly when I was a research fellow and presented some of this, and presented my early concerns at a meeting at the American Heart Association, the response was quite interesting. One professor got up and said, well, look, you're just a research fellow, I'm a professor, and why should we believe you when I'm saying the opposite? Because I was contradicting his research, even though I was presenting 4 times as many patients studied as he presented. So it's the reputations, and of course people are afraid of being sued. If you say the wrong thing, you may be sued for libel. So sometimes it's better for your career and your bank balance to say nothing.
Peter, just to kind of ask a question on that. So do you think actually it's more difficult for a clinician to make a U-turn than it is for a scientist?
It can be more difficult because certainly in the UK, we have in fact what's called a disparagement rule. I am not allowed to complain about other doctors. I'm not allowed to disparage them. In fact, I've been investigated by the GMC under the disparagement rule for reporting concerns. And they said I was disparaging these other doctors because I'd reported concerns about their research. They eventually found that my concerns were justified, that they'd done experiments on patients suffering acute neurological injury without informed consent, without ethics approval, without approval for the radioactive isotope they injected into them. But they initially tried to get me under the disparagement rule, so it can be more difficult in medicine. Jay Shah, the situation is only getting worse. We live in post-truth era where anecdotes and case reports are driving public opinion, and bad actors are actually taking centre stage with true scientists on the sidelines, since the message is more nuanced and less sensational. What is the solution to this rapid downward spiral we're in? I don't know. I wish we did. When you look at inaccuracies and distortions in the medical evidence base, what percent do you think is due to fraud versus what percent is sloppiness and human error? Don't know that either. It's difficult. It's impossible to know, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
So in the last 30 years, you've been looking at this. Do you think there's been improving or degrading even more? Any reason for hope? I don't think there's any reason to hope. I think there's more science and therefore more fraud.
More opportunity.
What are your thoughts on endemic corruption in academia in terms of grant reviewers stealing ideas and blocking grants, and also paper peer reviews? How do we stop so-called top professors stealing the work of upcoming researchers? I don't know how you do that. Roger, nice to hear from you. What do you consider your job? Well, I'm thinking of doing what Banerjee did, which was to pay someone to nominate him, apparently. I'm told that's what happened. That's what an MP told me happened. So, Roger, I'm prepared to give you a tenner if you're... No, I don't think. I don't think that we can rely on journals to police this. Do you think that the whole publication model industry should be changed? Well, there is a problem, as Richard Smith has written in his book, about the problems with medical journals. And a part of the problem is, of course, that many journals are owned by companies that are there to make profits. And of course, the big journals, when Richard Smith wrote his book about the problems with medical journals, big journals like the New England Journal and Nature and JAMA, if they published a positive study that was industry-based, so that a positive study about a drug or device, they would get reprint sales from the manufacturers of that drug and device. And that may account, Richard Smith reckoned that it was worth about $500,000 for one article in reprint sales. The companies would buy reprints to give to doctors. So if the New England Journal published each week 4 positive studies on drugs and devices, that's $2 million. And if they publish negative studies showing a device doesn't work or a drug doesn't work, the manufacturers are not going to buy that because they're not going to give it to people. So that's, $500,000 down the chute each week. And So they've got a big incentive to publish positive studies. So
I guess, Peter, though, it's fair to say that that's changing with many journals being open access these days and paper reprints being largely a thing of the past. I suspect that is changing in that as a revenue source for the journals, that is becoming less important. I don't undermine the fact, I'm not denying the fact that there is a huge amount of money sloshing around in the system anyway, but I think that particular revenue source has probably been a little bit limited by the move to open access, and I think that's got to be a good thing.
No, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I agree, open access, but it also brings some of the journals, of course, it brings in additional problems. For example, I'm bombarded on a daily basis by online journals offering to publish my research.
Yeah. That's true. We've swapped one monster for another one now because we all get these obscure journals bombarding us all the time. One last question then, Peter. We've got a question about whether universities and medical institutes should self-regulate this.
No, they can't self-regulate. We don't believe in self-regulation anywhere else. It doesn't work. We should stop them self-regulating.
What about the funders? It says that funders, and should they regulate it? Should they scrutinise our outputs?
Of course they should, but of course part of the problem, it depends who the funders are. If they are proper, national bodies, MRC and so on,
that's true.
They should. But of course, what you need to be careful of is if the funder is a pharmaceutical company, they want the right result for them, not necessarily the true result. So I think you actually need, as in say art fraud, the police have departments dealing with art fraud. You need people dealing with research fraud, properly trained investigators who can go in and inspect and demand to see the data.
Peter, I think you've done an amazing effort here in answering all these questions, but also thank you for your amazing effort over the last 30 years as well, because, I noticed that little quote in tiny letters on one of your slides about for evil to triumph, good men must do nothing. And I completely agree. And thank you for being a good man over the last 30 years. We need people to stand up, and I hope all of our audience recognise the importance of them individually, collectively standing up when they see things that aren't right. So, Peter, thank you for an absolutely stunning, shocking presentation. But I think we need to grasp this nettle. There's no good denying this. We need to recognise it exists and need to deal with it appropriately. And good people out there, and men and women, need to stand up. And thank you for your example in doing that. So, Peter, thank you for a spectacularly thought-provoking webinar. And we'll hand back to Davor to just round things up. Davor, thank you.
Thanks.
Peter, I would like to thank you as well. I am still stunned, by the way, because I have not heard you speak before. And I'm still stunned by what you presented and the experiences that you've shared with us. And I am fairly certain we will get a lot of responses such as mine. And thank you. I don't really have a lot to say apart from that. And for the audience, thank you for joining us. Mike, thank you for chairing. And I'm sure this will be viewed a lot on YouTube, and it will have a life of its own after this webinar as well. So
thank you, Pete.
See you all tomorrow, I guess, the audience. And Peter, once again, thank you for a fantastic webinar.
Thanks very much.